Am I racist? Now, if you're white, you're probably thinking, oh God, here we go again. Another politically correct person that's going to tell me that I'm a racist. But if we're being honest, you're probably imploding on the inside like these gophers in the God is a Woman music video. Or if you're a person of color, you're most likely thinking, yeah, racism exists. Tell me something I don't know. Well, let's ask ourselves a few questions. What is racism and who is racist? And is racism internalized differently by people of color versus white people? In an effort to answer those questions, let's use the earth as our metaphor for racism. Like our earth, racism is a series of layers which we can explore as we dig deeper beyond the surface. And we'll keep it simple and say that the layers are the crust, mantle, and the core. At the crust are what we call internalized oppression and normalized racism, microaggressions. So what do microaggressions and internalized oppression look or sound like? Well, a microaggression looks like a 40-year-old white man and 7th grade history teacher telling an 11-year-old child, "Shouldn't you be selling oranges on the side of the road?" That 11-year-old was me. Let me give you another example that had its pernicious moments though. Picture being on a street in New Orleans for a friend's birthday celebration. We were a group of about 20 people, and I was one of 3 people of color within that group. Everybody else were white men and women. One of the men, I'll call him Connor, didn't care for me whatsoever and had made that clear. So I'm standing in a circle having a conversation with 4 of the 20 people. Connor walks behind me, and all of a sudden I hear him spit out the water that he was drinking from his bottle. That spit water hits the back of my neck and my entire upper back. I'm mortified. And Connor claimed to have choked. Now, we can go back and forth about whether or not that was intentional. However, I'm most interested in what happened after that incident. Everyone in that group gave Connor the benefit of the doubt and consoled him for choking. Meanwhile, I was shown contempt. Nobody comforted me. In fact, a member of that group came to me later that day and said, "I'm glad you didn't make a scene because I would have put you in your place." Think about that. One of 3 people of color in a virtually all-white group is assaulted, not comforted at all, and then told that had he defended himself, he would have received more retaliation. Think about that. And those are just a few of many personal examples. Now, an example of internalized oppression is my 18-year-old self going to court and changing my foreign-sounding birth name from José Leal to a white European one, Joey Pierre. My experiences and path of decolonizing my mind will be a lifelong journey, and that journey has led me to where I am now as Teikoa, which is a combination of Japanese and Hawaiian. Teiko, Japanese for resistance, and Koa, Hawaiian for warrior. Teikoa, resistance warrior. So what are you thinking at the moment? Are you saying, okay, Teikoa, but they didn't mean it and it wasn't their intention to say or do something negative? Or what's wrong with changing your name? Let's revisit our metaphor because these individual acts of prejudice and bias are informed by the layer beneath the crust, the mantle. At this layer exist solidified institutions that perpetuate and sustain racism, like the media, education, and government. And before we move on, let's ask ourselves the following. What media messages did you receive and inherently internalize growing up about your racial group? And which media messages were given to you about how to constructively engage with another racial group outside of your own? Those questions are important to ask ourselves because the media disproportionately displays white people over people of color, or worse yet, not represent people of color at all. Symbolic annihilation. Let me tell you about a recent interaction with a 7-year-old white cousin of mine. So I was playing Pokemon Go, and yes, I play Pokemon Go. Don't judge. And in this game are 3 color-coded teams and leaders: the red team, blue team, and the yellow team. I'm with the red team. So my little cousin notices my gym leader and says, "I don't like her." I'm interested, so I ask, "Oh, why not?" And he says, "Because she's bad." So then I show him the blue leader and ask him, "What do you think about this leader?" He says, "She's okay, I like her." Then I show him the yellow leader and ask him, "What do you think about this one?" And he says, "Oh yeah, I like him, he's cool." Now, if racism relies on intention, how is it that a 7-year-old child has deemed the black leader as bad and the white male leader as cool? That interaction is an example of the affect and effect of racial socialization on children. It also served as my version of the Clark doll experiment. And to be clear, there's tons of empirical evidence that show that children by the age of 3 understand that it's better to be white, which by inference means that you and I have equally internalized that same message since we were 3 years old. This unfortunately makes sense because we see whiteness centered everywhere. Whiteness is centered in all of our favorite Marvel movies, which I swear have at least 10 actors named Chris. It's also centered in many of our favorite cartoons, like Disney movies, the entire Dragon Ball series, or if you're a family of religious faith, you'll notice whiteness represented as God and Jesus. So why is that? Why does the media disproportionately display stories about white people over people of color? And why isn't this story about a Mexican girl with a higher IQ than Einstein plastered throughout all media? Why? Well, let's take a breath. Because these disparities run deep and we need to continue digging through the mantle. Which leads us to our next question. What did you learn about your racial group's contributions to human progress and to American history? Well, if you're an American, you were taught a Eurocentric curriculum. This system promotes the idea that white Europeans are solely responsible for everything great in modern society. We were told about the contributions of the Romans, Greeks, and the Americans saving World War II against the bad whites, or Nazis. But to be clear, just because there is no equal mention of the contributions of people of color does not mean they don't exist. In fact, there are plenty of historical figures and groups who we can memorialize, like Ella Baker, the connection between the Iroquois Confederacy and our Constitution, the Harlem Hellfighters, Dolores Huerta, James Baldwin, and many more historical examples that are left out of white history books. So there's a consistent habit of acknowledging one truth of the American story, as well as the global story. And the difficult work for we people of color is to collect those fragmented pieces of history and put them back together. For example, what is the connection between the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804? Are we to believe that France gave up the territory they controlled out of benign consideration for the Americans? The short answer is, of course not, and that history is not that simple. In fact, the so-called French territory was actually controlled and occupied by several native tribes. And the Haitians led a successful slave revolution in which they gained their own freedom by defeating the French imperial power by 1804. France was suffering economically during the revolution and lost its most profitable colony. So history didn't just happen or was a mistake. History is a series of choices that occur within a context and not a rose-tinted view. Now, we're almost to the core. However, let's ask ourselves a few sensitive questions. Are all white spaces and social groups natural? Or are those segregated spaces historically designed? Again, the short answers are no and yes. We have copious amounts of unlawful evidence that show intentional prejudice and discrimination against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Meanwhile, white people have been elevated and assisted through government policies and real estate. Racial nepotism. We have a history that has given a leg up to white people while other groups have been given black codes, forced assimilation, separate but equal, racist housing policies deemed as constitutional, like redlining, white capping, or what is now gentrification, and so much more. Racism is a system. It's the societal context that we live in, and it continues to evolve and adapt over time. But don't just take my word for it. Dr. Carol Anderson does an amazing job at explaining America's racist policies and patterns in her book titled White Rage. And she agrees that there are many other laws trying to be ratified that will negatively affect working class Black and other people of color today. Now, are you asking yourself, but what can explain the individual bias at the crust and the systemic racism at the mantle? What could possibly be at the core? At the core is white supremacy and the tools that keep it in place. Those tools include operating from the 18th century pseudoscientific idea of racial biology and hierarchy, as well as unequal, racialized economic disadvantage known as capitalism. The people at the top are disproportionately white, and their decisions don't reflect the reality at the bottom. For example, take a look at who Bazaar magazine voted as the 50 hottest men of all time in 2018. 33 of the 50 men are white, 11 are Black, 1 Latin, 1 is Indian Asian, 1 Asian, 1 North African, and the remaining 2 are of mixed race. In other words, 66% of the hottest men of all time are white, 22% are Black, and less than 1% are all other races. The core people in power spread messages of how they view the world, and their messages are present in everyday life. So as we move within the earth, from the core, through the mantle, and onto the crust, along with prejudice, bias, microaggressions, and internalized oppression, we also have white narratives. White narratives which mask the issue of racism as opposed to addressing it, and absolve individuals of their absorbed racist framework. Narratives like, well, people of color are also racist and say racist things. Stop making this about race and playing the race card. Or one of my personal favorites, no, they can't be racist, they're a good person. And finally, that's racist towards white people. To be clear though, those statements are perverse and specious at best. For example, the race card is played 24/7. It's called the white card. And there's never been a time in this country and the world where people of color have systematically subjugated the white racial group. Neither historically nor currently. You can experience individual prejudice. However, the system of racism serves to elevate whiteness. So, reverse racism does not exist. And so what do we do now? How do we combat systemic racism? Well, self-awareness through critical thought is a good start. That will develop and strengthen our racial literacy as opposed to normalizing the messages that are coming at us from the top down. So I encourage us, especially white people, to acknowledge the correlation between the biases that we hold and the messages from the mantle that inform public opinion, and then practice self-accountability for those biases. We all know that simplicity is compelling. However, there is nothing simple about the distortion and general contempt of the history, experiences, perspectives, and opinions of people of color. There is equally nothing simple about white people being unaware that they too are racialized beings and feeling culturally superior because of the whiteness of their skin, and then feeling shame, guilt, and anger when called in on their racial biases. Weaponized white feelings. So ask yourself, how do these messages and layers affect us? Because we all unknowingly receive messages about race every day, all day. So if you're a person of color watching this video, ask yourself these sensitive questions that have also been asked by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. How have I aligned myself with whiteness? And what does that look like for me? I know those are hard questions to answer because it took me years to understand and acknowledge my own internalized oppression and alignment with whiteness, and to move past that shame. You and I have been socialized by the same external forces that give us the message that white is right. However, I encourage you to make conscious, self-loving choices. For example, don't engage with white people who want to feel safe in conversations about race. You can choose to withhold your experience so that you're not leading the race talk. Instead, question white people on their nonsensical and uninformed opinions on race. Let them do the work. Or, on the other hand, make the empowered choice to engage when you feel able to, but know that you'll most likely engage in mental gymnastics. Conscious, empowered choices put you and your needs on the table and take white comfort off the table. Racial bias is not normal, accidental, and certainly not benign. It is a symptom of a much larger insidious issue that has a strong historical and present impact, and you shouldn't have to manage the impact of racism. You are all individual beings with a valid set of experiences and opinions and have a wealth of non-white historical roots. Now, if you're a white person watching this, especially for those in other marginalized groups like women or the gay and lesbian community, what's truly keeping you from connecting with people of color on this issue? Why in 2020 do you dismiss, deflect, and invalidate people of color on this issue? White women and white gay and lesbian community, I want you to think about all the oppressive comments towards your group. Pause the video and take a minute to think about this. Now, close your eyes and hold on to the one that elicits the most visceral response for you. Imagine that a straight white male said that to you. Imagine that you gave him feedback on that sexist or heterosexist comment. And imagine being told all of these narratives. It was just a joke. Gosh, you are so sensitive. You're so angry right now, you really need to calm down. You know, I just don't get sexism or heterosexism. I just don't get it. I don't understand, and I don't know what to do about it. Or what if he stayed silent after you've trusted and opened up to him about the issue that affects you? How would you feel? What would his communication say about him? And how do you think people of color feel when we hear those same narratives on racism? Open your eyes. My point is to be open to conversations about race. Don't close them. And be aware of how you feel. That's important because your feelings have the unnecessary ability to become the focal point when talking about your race and can derail conversations about racism. So if you feel uncomfortable, guilty, angry, etc., acknowledge it and take self-responsibility for it. Because how you feel will determine whether what you hear is aligning with what I'm actually saying and affect how you will react. And so the ultimate question, especially for white people, is not, am I racist? But rather, how have these racist reflections of the American psyche informed and influenced me? And how is it manifesting in my day-to-day behavior? My name is Teikoa. Thank you for watching.